Loud. Okay. Um, uh, we're gonna. I'm Neil Marquez. I haven't introduced myself. I am the forecast program manager at Portland State University Population Research Center. And we're here today because we're going to be mostly discussing the Oregon Population Forecast Program and specifically the forecast for Lane County. And if you had joined us in November, thank you for participating in that meeting. The difference between November and today is November is the preliminary forecast. We make those forecasts basically with zero input from cities at all, just the data that we have available to us through state and national resources. And that's by intention, is to just give us a baseline. But what we really want is information and input via the survey responses that we sent out to y'all, as well as participation in November in this meeting today. That you can give us information about what's happening on the ground in terms of city projects, new subdivisions, things along those lines that I'll mention during the presentation that we just don't have access to in a centralized source. They're going to help us improve those projects. So thank you for participating today. Thank you for participating previously in the survey responses and the meetings from last time. And I will say if at any point you have questions during the presentation, just interrupt me. I really don't want to be talking for 90 minutes straight, so questions are definitely welcome. If you have questions afterwards too, or at any point as well, I'm the forecast program manager. I'm going to be answering all the questions about forecast. Huda mentioned that she is the estimates manager here today. She'll answer questions about estimates. What are estimates and what are forecasts is sometimes confusing, especially because that changes on the year-to-year basis. You might not know who to ask. If you send an email to askprc@pdx.edu, it always gets filtered to the right person and we can move it there. We will also forward it to the right person, but if you just don't know who to email, that's a good one to go to. And I mentioned this meeting is being recorded and these are going to be posted online. The slides, this conversation, as well as the tables with our new updated numbers will all be posted early next week, probably by Monday, to our link on there on the population forecast page on our website. I'm joined today by Ethan and Huda, the Director and Population Estimates Manager, but we have a large team who are helping to contribute to make both the population estimates and the forecast and a number of other projects that we do at the Population Research Center possible. So I just want to give them a quick shout out. It's not just the three of us here. We are your representatives for today for this project, but there's a large group of people who are working on both the estimates and the projections and everything. So just to give a quick outline, I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Why are we here? Just expanding on this a little bit. Updates. These are going to be updates since November. What have we incorporated into our data and our process and our thinking as well in terms of these forecasts, because we have some new information and have just got a better insight on sort of trends and things that are happening. And I just want to fill you in on those updates on what we've done since last time. We'll move on to a county overview. We do these multi-level forecasts. We start with a county forecast, make a forecast at the county level, and then we do the UGB forecast afterwards and harmonize those two so that they match and everything lines up and everything. So we'll start with the county, then we'll dig into the urban growth boundaries forecast for each of those. And there isn't as many UGBs as some of the other counties, but if we want to spend more time on one rather than another for people who are here in this room, I think we have pretty good representation though. So I think we'll probably spend a bit of time on each of them, but I'm happy to go into further conversation for any of these as well. Okay, so while we're here, I mentioned this earlier, we're here to discuss the Oregon Population Forecast Program, specifically the population forecast for Lane County. And the population forecasts are made with the explicit purpose of land use planning. We do this at multiple levels for counties and urban growth boundaries, but we also do this by different demographics as well. We do this by age and sex, and most recently we have incorporated race ethnicity forecasts, which we discussed a little bit last time in November. That's the first time we've done this for this county. We started doing that about 2 years ago. And the mandates that we have, the state mandates that we have for these forecasts are that they must be updated every 4 years. The last time we've made forecasts for Lane County was in 2021 when we published these results. Cover a 50-year forecast horizon. I know that the planning horizon is 20 years, and that's what people care a lot about. We extend past that by quite a bit just to give people extra room for other long-term planning purposes as well. We include the most up-to-date data. We're always getting new information, both from national data sources, federal data sources, but as well as Oregon-specific sources from OHA, from driver's license data, from things like that, just to get some signal on what's happening here within the state as well. We allow for public input and objections. That's what these meetings are for, to allow you to influence the forecast as well and give us feedback. Let us know if we're missing something. That's the big thing here. And I'll go over the timelines on what we're looking for, just so you know how much time we have for input and changing these forecasts and everything. And then lastly, all the methods and results are publicly available. We always publish our methods online. You can look at last year's methods. They're already up there, and it's very similar to what's going to be there in this year. And like I said, we'll publish these tables and everything on Monday so that you have access to the data and everything and can really dig into it and inspect it. So our forecast program cycle is always a 1-year cycle. So we've been started on the counties of Benton, Lane, Lincoln, Lynn, Marion, and Polk as of last July. Where we updated our data and our methodology where appropriate. We prepared those preliminary forecasts, which we presented in November. Since November, we've been updating and everything. And then usually in March, we're a little bit early right now, we release the proposal forecast and hold these second public meetings for input and everything. Between November and March, we have hopefully captured most of the important things, and you're going to see some pretty big changes for some UGBs in terms of incorporating new information that we didn't have last time compared to what was in November. That being said, we're still in a phase of making adjustments. Between now and March 15th, and I'll have that specific date on there as well, we have room to make adjustments in a pretty informal way. After when March 15th starts, through May 5th, it's a formal objection period. And we say we have spent this time, and on PSU side, we have spent the time collecting the data in order to make the forecast the best that we can. And now we ask that you submit in writing, and we have a form for this, why you think that we should alter the forecast because they're not incorporating something that we absolutely need to incorporate. And that's due by May 5th, and we have a more formal process of reviewing that alongside and going approving it with DLCD of whether we should make those adjustments or not and everything. We're totally happy to make those adjustments if we are missing something that we should really be incorporating. It's just letting you know it's a little bit easier to make the adjustments prior to that beforehand. Yeah. So just a quick, I know most of you are probably here in November, but I do just want to give a quick review on how we make our forecast. So it's county first and then UGB, and we harmonize the UGB to the county. And when we do it at the county level, we say that population can only change in 3 ways. And that's from births, increases, deaths, decreases, and then net migration. If there's more people coming in, then it's an increase. If there's more people leaving than coming in, then it's a decrease, right? So we want to make sure that we capture those 3 components. And if we can capture those 3 components, then we know everything about population change that can happen. For births and deaths, we have pretty good demographic theory on how those change after time, although our understanding of the rate of change is quickly updating. But generally, births across Oregon, across the US, internationally, are declining over time. And we know that the speed at which they're declining, we have a better understanding of now. Deaths are declining over time in their age-specific rate. Life expectancy is increasing. People are living longer lives. More deaths happen now because of an aging population. More people are older than they were 20, 30 years ago at the population level. But generally, life expectancy itself is increasing over time. Migration is fickle. On a year-to-year basis, there can be huge fluctuations on the number of people coming into a particular county. So it's hard to say on any given 1 year exactly what migration is going to look like. Our goal with the forecasting isn't to get any 1 year correct, it's to get long-term trends correct. And so because of that, what we use is a 30-year average of what migration has looked like into the county over the past 30 years. We will make adjustments sometimes when migration tends to be higher in more recent years than in previous years. If we see a big shift away, then we'll weight more recent years a little bit more heavily. If we see declines, we're more hesitant to weight more recent years. We'll just say this is kind of a lull right now, and we think that migration is going to pick up at some time as the general trend. Yeah.
Curious where adoptions go in there.
Adoptions, sorry, what kind of adoptions?
So they're not, they're brought into the population not through birth.
Oh, child adoptions.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about city adoptions or something
Well,
like that, yeah.
Annexation.
Okay, yeah. So that would be to the birthing parent that we're associating that with. So as there is a move in adoption, technically in this model, what we're thinking of, if it's like moving from out of county to into county, that would be a migration event that we're capturing it into adoption.
Yeah.
How well we capture it is up for debate. I think that that's totally fair. The population contribution there for most locations is probably pretty small, but if that's something that we need to take into account for a particular location, then I definitely want to hear about it because we're not making any sort of large scale adjustments, but in theory, it would be captured in the migration that's happening. Yeah. For UGBs, moving on to the smaller geographies, we use a housing unit model as our baseline for estimating forecast or a forecast for the UGBs. And what the housing unit model basically says is that for any population in any given year, you can forecast them by looking at the population in the previous year, population at T-1 in that equation there, looking at the change in the number of housing units and multiplying that change by the persons per household and the occupancy rate. Housing is not, I will say right now, a perfect predictor of growth in housing. It is not a perfect predictor for how many new people are coming into a UGB or a city by any means, but it is pretty strongly correlated with population growth in an area. This is our baseline. We do want to make sure that we've made adjustments for population growth that can occur outside of this paradigm. And very specific to Eugene, which we didn't capture in our initial model, but thanks to your survey responses, we've made adjustments for, is capturing changes in group quarter populations, which is a big one, right? For populations, group quarter populations are people who live in non-traditional housing units. These could be care homes, these can be carceral settings, but important for Eugene is the college age population. It's over here. Our baseline assumption is always that these group quarter populations are going to remain stable over time. So in our forecast, when populations are growing, we take out group quarters before we start that. They remain stable, add them back on at the end, unless we get information that they're expanding. So we got a survey response from Eugene detailing the expansions and what that looks like. So now when we take that on, they're growing as well with the population. So we've incorporated that. So you'll see Eugene's forecast pushed up a little bit since the last time in November. I will say right now, it's still not as high as last time we made it 4 years ago, and I'll explain why. I think you probably already know why, but we'll go into that like moving forward as well. It's not a Eugene specific thing. It's a Oregon thing.
Just quick
Mhm.
question, when you say the baseline assumption is group quarters stay stable, is that as a percentage of the whole? Just
As a number.
As a number.
As a number, yeah. We tend to see group quarters increase in burst rather and like then in a stable population growth in the same way that we see the non-group quarter population grow. So for the long term, there probably is going to be something that's happening. But for our forecast right now in the planning period, we really want to know about what that growth is rather than assume anything. If we can get evidence that there is a stable growth within a group quarter population, we definitely want to know about that and then we'll think about that when we're incorporating it, but our baseline is always stable. So if there is a group quarter that you're thinking about in your jurisdiction, and you think that that is not going to fit with this model, we definitely want to know about it. Yeah. And I throw it all.
Just to add to that, I think like one example of kind of how that's arisen out of the research is on, demand for nursing facilities, right? Like the big part of our projections, one of our big findings is about aging population. But because there's so much aging in place, we actually have looked at most projections for demand for skilled nursing facilities is pretty flat. And so, yeah, it's things like that make us, cautious to just kind of say, well, if the population of Lane County were to double, then, or Eugene were to double, then the number of dorm beds at UO would double. So it wouldn't,
Yeah. And then I will say, this wasn't the case here, but for other locations in Corvallis and their enrollment, we're not just looking at enrollment either. It's because even though enrollment is increasing in some universities, it doesn't also always necessarily mean that you're going to have an increase in physical presence. as well. So that's something that for universities and things that we do take into account. So expansions to the dorm in particular is a stronger indicator for us rather than like enrollment trends. So that's another thing that like we're competing against as well. Yeah. There's gonna be one more thing that I was gonna say, and so I throw our assumptions here, not because I think our assumptions are the best assumptions and always right at any given time, just so that you know that like what they are, and so we're always happy to change those assumptions at any given point. If you can provide us information on why we should change them, happy to incorporate them. Another thing that is not included in this, which we were talking about earlier, is things like moratoriums, building moratoriums that aren't, our housing unit forecast are just based on past trends of housing unit productions. If we know that there's a moratorium coming up or currently in place on a particular location, then we want to make sure that we incorporate that because we know that no new units are coming into this location that is going to greatly affect population change. In addition, on the flip side to this, if new subdivisions are coming in, especially for smaller cities like below the 20-30,000 range, that's going to have a huge impact on population change as well. And we want to make sure that we're incorporating that. So new subdivisions in particular areas are a big deal for us in terms of adjusting the forecast as well. And then the last other one that we like to hear about as well is new major employers that are coming into the area. We don't always incorporate adjustments for new employers, but if there is a major shift in the employment structure of happening within a particular city, then we'll start considering potentially upping the housing unit rate if we think this is going to lead to a new influx of new individuals moving to the area for employment and everything. Yeah. We also compare that against employment flows as well, because we know just because a new employer isn't coming in, sometimes they don't live within an area. So we use census data to look at movement between different cities, commute flows and things like that. But employers is generally something that we do want to know about as well. So after this meeting, so last time I followed up, or if I didn't follow up with you and I said it's because you provided a survey response that answered a lot of the questions that I was going for. So thank you for that. But we're going to ask this time that you follow up for email if you have concerns about the projections. Or we can set up a meeting today if you do. We did that at the yesterday as well, just immediately set up a meeting to figure out things out. If we can get it figured out by March 15, that's great. That's when the open discussion period ends. As part of the Oregon Population Forecast Program and our requirements to DLCD, we're supposed to have a 45-day open objection period. I think that's maybe a little bit more than 45 days, but between March 15th and May 5th is the objection period. Submit formal responses to like, hey, PSU PRC needs to change their forecast and here are the reasons why. We'll review those and make any changes by by May 15th. And no further changes will be made after May 15th. That's when we call off the changes, and that just gives us enough time to finalize everything, write up the reports, put together the data tables, and we'll have those on our website by June 15th. And then these become the new forecast for planning purposes on July 1st. And I'll put that date on there as a bullet point as well on July 1st, 2025. So up until then, the old forecasts still hold true. Starting July 1st, the new forecasts become the one for the planning horizon and everything. Any questions before updates? Great. Okay. So big difference between this time and last time is just y'all's participation in this and the survey and preliminary meeting feedback. We got, survey responses from over 20 different organizations this time, indicating for us that we need to change the forecast, or that like the forecast alignment looks pretty similar to like what y'all are seeing on the ground. That just gives us a good signal of like what's happening, even if we don't make changes explicitly to any particular like UGB as well. It's extremely helpful. And I'll mention again why as well, but later. But when we do make changes, I just wanted to mention really quickly the kind of changes that we make. Even if we didn't make change for your city this year, just the kind of things that we look for when we're making changes and why we make changes, just so you get a flavor of that. Or if maybe something comes to mind that maybe like, oh, maybe we should have said something about this. a big one and an obvious one is we want to make sure our GIS boundaries are right. That maybe sounds silly for the UGBs, but by the time that a city approves an update to the urban growth boundaries, it approves it. It moves through the channels and gets approved by the state. Then those files are then sent over to DLCD, digitized, and then gets incorporated into the central database for urban growth boundaries. There's a lag. So we could have an approval of an urban growth boundary, but they won't get updated in the database for sometimes. And sometimes that lag interferes with like the forecast. And that happened this time. But when we show maps and you're like, hey, this is what we think the urban growth boundary is, and you're like, no, that's not right, we can circumvent that and go around the database and incorporate updates as well. So that's a big helpful one. Are we getting the urban growth boundaries right is a big deal because that's what we're forecasting for. Accounting for large public works, all those moratoriums and things like that are a big deal, and we had several instances of that. Group quarter expansions, like I had mentioned before, adjusting for housing unit productions with new subdivisions. I think all of these impacted, aside from the UGB one, locations here in the county. Housing build moratoriums as well. But in addition, so all those factors incorporate the numbers and go into our modeling process and affect the numbers. But in addition, your survey responses in particular, and we're going to try and incorporate some of the conversations that we have or concerns that we have here today as well into the reports, but your survey responses get incorporated into the reports. And that's extremely helpful for contextualizing the forecast as well. I know that people are very concerned with a specific number and the change over time, but giving some insight into the conversations on how we got to that number or concerns about that particular number always get put in the reports as well. And so then we can look at those reports and be like, yeah, this is the number, but here was the conversation that was going on. Here's what people are thinking about in terms of population growth. And selfishly, this helps me a ton because I can go and look back 4 years ago and see what were the conversations happening 4 years ago, what were people thinking about, and when I'm making this forecast, give a better give a better forecast update and address those concerns. But for readers of that document as well, contextualizing that information of being like, okay, here is what people, here's what the conversations had, I think is a big deal. I had also gotten a response in the survey responses that people were interested in reading other people's survey responses as well. That they didn't care that it was just about their own submission. They want to know what other cities are thinking. And yeah, all of those city responses are incorporated into the county document as well. And you can go into other counties and read their responses as well. I know each city has their own unique issues that they're dealing with, but there tends to be a lot of overlap as well, even if the cities are very different in terms of the conversations that are being had as well. So all of those are publicly available. The Lane County ones, the ones for here, will be available in that report, but you have access to all the previous ones as well. And I'm happy to get to that to you early if it's something that's pressing for you, if you're interested in that as well. A big change is this year is the first year that we were able to harmonize the population forecast with the population estimates that HUDA produces. So the estimates are the things that happened previously. The forecast is everything that's happening in the future. In previous years, whenever we made the forecast, there would be a 1-year lag in terms of where the forecasts were starting from. So if we did this in the same way that we did it last year, if I made these forecasts now, I would be basing them off of 2023 estimates. What that meant was if you were having conversations with HUDA and the estimates team about incorporating corrections or adjustments or about new housing production levels into your city, that was missed in that forecast cycle, and we wouldn't be able to incorporate that. HUDA has been able to move up our estimate cycle so that we are able to incorporate the new certified estimates this year, which I thank her for speeding up her schedule and everything. And I think that just leads to a better product at the end, because everything that you're having conversations with HUDA now also gets incorporated into the forecasts on my end as well. So it is benefiting or just reflecting better in both of these products as well. So you get that as well. So I just want to say this is the first year that we were able to do this and move our schedule, and it's something that we had to retool our processes for a little bit, but this is the first year that we get the fruit of that labor moving forward, and so just quick shout out to that. Another exciting thing is that we're not the only one that make population estimates and projections for the state of Oregon, right? And in the estimates in particular, the US Census Bureau makes estimates for the state and the county as well as cities. And if you were following the US Census Bureau's estimates, which are used for federal distribution of funds, whereas the state estimates are used for state distribution of funds, the US Census Bureau has said that Oregon has been declining in population size for the past 3 years or 2 years. This year, they have updated their estimates to say that Oregon has actually been growing in size, which is what we have been saying for the past couple of years. And not only that, they have revised their past estimates to say that Oregon has been growing, I believe, for the past 2 years as well, which is more in line with what we have been saying. So I think that's great. I mean, we were going to move forward with our estimates. We're confident in our estimates anyway, but I think it's great when we can have more harmony in terms of other organizations also reflecting the same pattern of population growth over time. So just want to throw that out there. This is a fun article to read that was in the Oregonian, I believe, as well. That's like, oh, PSC, PRC must feel validated now that the census agrees with them. So yes, we did feel validated. The other thing, looking at fertility, also an article, I believe, from the Oregonian, is Oregon's birth rate. So as you probably already know, Oregon, relative to other locations, has a very low fertility rate, very low birth numbers compared to other states. And this fell during the pandemic. The general consensus among demographers and other people who study fertility patterns was that it was falling because there was an uncertainty in the economy, in public health, in some of these institutions. And so why don't we just wait to have children, push this off for a few years? But that fertility rate is going to bounce back. We're going to see that a bounce back and people are going to start having kids the same way that they were pre-pandemic. That never happened. This is an article from 2024. We have not seen that bounce back in fertility. And for the past 2 years, we have incorporated this bounce back to some degree, always to a lessening degree over time. But this is the first year where we're like, okay, we have to make the shift. We just have to move that this isn't actually happening. This is an update that was also reflected in the US Census Bureau's most recent population forecast as well. And is a big reason why the Census Bureau has made the biggest adjustment in their national forecast in between any two cycles. Between the last time they made their forecast and this time, we saw the biggest drop in the population forecast. In addition, this is the first time that they are projecting in the US totally that population is decline at some point in the forecast horizon, that there's going to be less people in the US than the year before during the forecast cycle. So something to keep in mind. That's not something that's happening in this county, but the lower fertility rates is something that is impacting the rate of growth that we're forecasting moving forward as well. I will say that 2024, the preliminary estimates, is the first year since the pandemic had started, since 2020, where we didn't have a decline in the births. It seems like maybe this is somewhere around the stabilizing number, anything. We're still seeing a drop in the rates, but at least now it's not outpacing the growth in the population. So what we're seeing, at least preliminary, is like, okay, maybe it's not the rapid spiral that we were seeing for the past like 3 years. Maybe it's stabilizing or in around this rate as well. Yeah.
What is the, for the census, how often do they update their?
It's around 6 years. It's not always like that. There was a 2024 update, and prior to that, it was 2017, I think. I think it was
2013.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not like mandated.
No.
So they have more flexibility in when they do them.
Mhm. Whereas ours is, yeah, about always every 4 years.
There is a more frequent federal one that's done by the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. That one is mandated, and I think that's done every year or 2 years.
Yeah, and theirs tends to be a little bit more bullish. They do have higher forecasts than the US Census Bureau, but also you see them adjusting it downward every year as well. Life expectancy changes also impacted by COVID. And so these life expectancies are a little bit different than you'll see in the graph specific for here for Linn County, but these come from CDC estimates, but they just give us a general trend. Here's the Oregon life expectancy. And you can see with the start of COVID, we saw a dramatic decline in life expectancy. A lot of that was COVID related deaths, but also impacting that is deaths to despair and injury incidents rising at the same time during this period. Unlike fertility, however, we already have seen this bounce back. We have seen a comeback in the life expectancy heading in the up direction, as it had been prior to like 2018 and everything. So this is an encouraging sign. We're still not back to what we were in 2020 or 2019 or even 2020, you know, but the general trend is that we're moving up in life expectancy as well. So we're in better ground here that life expectancy is moving in that positive direction, increasing over time. That is, people are dying at a lower rate than they were in previous years, than the year before. Yeah. Okay. And then I'll move into the county specific stuff moving forward. Just to give us an overview, just at a glance at high level demographics. Kind of unsurprisingly, the population age 0 to 17 in Lane County, about 400,000 population, that as of the 2020 census. This is 2020 census data, I should say, in comparison to Oregon. But age 0 to 17 rather is a little bit young or a little bit older, less than the Oregon total. Whereas the population at 65 plus is a little bit over, so a little bit older again than the Oregon total. Population who is non-white is at 16.45%. This is also less than the Oregon total. Generally speaking, when you have a lower non-white population, it tends to be an older population as well. The non-white populations tend to be a little bit younger on average in total. So this is a common pattern that you see in combination with those two. Persons per household is 2.36, a little bit lower than the state average. And again, with aging population, this is something that we see as well, just a lower persons per household. There's going to be a lot of fluctuation and differences across cities as well, though. And we use a person per household and an occupancy rate for that equation that I mentioned that's specific to the city. So even though this is county, this is just to give you a general trend on like what's happening in the county, but we use city specific data in order for those growth patterns as well. So, since the census, what has been happening? So this is since 2020, and this is coming from vintage 2024 estimates from the population estimates program. And so what you're going to see is between 2020 and 2021, a population decline. Lane County has a factor that leads to population decline in that you both have like a major city here and a major city that has a large student age population. And both of those were pretty hard in the year after the pandemic in terms of population decline, right? This is a pattern that we've seen across the state of Oregon as well. This definitely happened within Portland. This is definitely happening in Corvallis as well. Similar pattern here in terms of the population. You just see it overall with Lane County. And then we've seen bounce back over time. It was a 0.6% decline here. And if you look at the population total from 2020 to 2024, we're at 3826 and 3827. We've got back that population and we are headed in the right direction. But when we're looking at the forecast period, I just want you to keep in mind that we've essentially lost 4 years of growth in that past trajectory that we had before. And it's not like we're moving at a growth rate that's accelerating, that is a quick rebound. It's even growing a bit slower than what we saw pre-pandemic moving forward. So we're definitely thinking about that and incorporating it into our mindset for our population forecast as well. This isn't to say that we don't see signs of like growth and movement forward within the county, but rather a slowing of growth moving forward. This is a convoluted graph. It's just here to give us a sign of like what employment change looks like over time. For growing counties, we want to see movement upwards, especially in the major industries that are within a particular county. So a big one, right? Education and health services here. Let's just isolate that one really quick. We know this is a huge industry within the county. With the university here, with the hospitals here. So we want to make sure this is moving up because that's a good indicator of population growth moving forward. And lo and behold, it looks like it is. Looking at trade, transportation, and utilities here, another one that has been growing over time. Government as well is another big employer. Government tends to grow slower than some of the private industries, but even so, we still see some growth within this area as well. Generally, again, we just want to see these patterns moving up rather than down if population increases are happening. We don't incorporate any of this information into the equations for forecasting or anything. It's more just to contextualize, again, just to give us a signal of like what's happening here. Another one, even though it's small, is construction is a big help in terms of like new housing production as well. We just want to make sure that isn't declining, but rather at least remaining stable or moving in a positive direction. The other one is, so we model migration as net migration, but we also want to make sure that we're understanding the flows. Where are people moving in when they come into the county, and where are people moving out when they're moving out of the county? A big one in terms of migration flows, both in and out, is from Multnomah County. You have this connection with Multnomah County. For most counties, this is a little bit abnormal in that for most counties, it's the nearest county that is the biggest sender and receiver in terms of migration flows. But for a number of social and economic reasons, there's strong connections between Multnomah County, right, and here. And so you see a strong connection both in the ins and outs. Most recent census says that there's more people leaving than coming from Multnomah County, but on average, more people are coming into the county than leaving. On average, and it's contributing to population growth within the area. You also have this one where there's a strong connection between California, Los Angeles. I think that's probably a university effect that's happening over here. Out-of-state students coming into the area. We see a similar pattern in Benton, where there's a strong connection between Asia as a continent and moving in as well. Universities can have a strong impact on migration moving in, so that's what you're seeing there. Yeah.
Are there other counties that are maybe a little bit lower than that are outside Oregon?
Yes, oh, definitely. Yeah, these are the top 5, I should say, in and top 5 out, that we're showing here. But if you would like a more detail on where people are coming from, we can definitely show that, but
I
yes,
just get
yeah.
that question all the time.
Oh, yeah. So migration is very difficult to track, in terms of getting this level of detail. This is coming from the American Community Survey, which for younger age populations doesn't have the best track record of capturing everyone that's in there. Nevertheless, even with that, you're still getting this signal from the college age students that I think is validating that you are capturing some of that. I wouldn't take any of those specific numbers at face value, but rather just like the highs are probably indicators of highs and the lows are probably indicators of lows. But if you would like that, happy to put something together for you for the county. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing we could do, since these are ACS data, they have associated margins of error.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing from year to year, the ACS.
Yeah.
Just sometimes because it's a relatively small sample, it's the biggest survey of its kind, but it's still
Yeah.
only 1.5% of people, and it sometimes in some year just doesn't get to the right people.
Right.
Some of that's reflected in margins of error.
Yeah.
But then, like Neil said, also that college students are kind of pretty unlikely to respond to things that come in the mail telling them to fill it out, and so the data can be spotty if they're in households. In dorms, it's better because they work with the dorm administrators to collect the
Yeah.
data. But
Yeah, so you will get it better in dorms, that's right. And I should say this is a 5-year average between 2018 and 2022. That we're capturing this data from. So you smooth over, so you get a little bit bigger sample size, but it's the 5-year average for this
I'll
location.
just blame increased housing costs on in migrating Californians.
Yeah.
So there's more to this story.
Yeah, interesting. It would be
yeah, I
interesting
feel
to
like
look at the age
I think we did a
profile.
table like that, showing. So the thing is that I think that's true, but it's also been true for a long time, and I think it's also, I forget what percentage of the migration it is, but I want to say it's less than half, and it does vary by region. I'll see if I can find that table before we're done.
Yeah. Analysis based on tax returns over a period of time and saw very similar of what you're seeing there.
Yeah.
And that corresponds with what we saw using a different data source.
Okay.
Was it with the federal, the IRS tax returns?
Boy,
Or-
you didn't ask that.
Okay,
I can send you what we did.
okay.
We
Just asking 'cause I know
included it in
Yeah.
20.
Yeah,
We're very interested in, working with the Oregon Department of Revenue. We kind of have not had success, working with them to do research, but I know the IRS does publish county to county flows.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's.
that's what you're using. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so we use that for our migration signal, but there's always that delay in terms of like when they publish those results, which means it's great data, but you don't know for a couple of years.
And we don't know the
what impact.
characteristics of the
Yeah,
flows,
and you
but
don't know the
just the magnitude.
characteristics.
Yeah,
Right, yeah. There's something else I was gonna say. Oh, in the individual cities and everything, maybe a sort of parallel indicator to that, we do have inflation adjusted household income over time as well. So you can sort of just get like a idea of like, is the household nature like changing over time? Is there a difference in the household income over time, which for some cities there isn't, and some cities there are big changes. So population forecast, moving forward. Before I get into the specifics, I just want to say what we're looking at here. So everything to the left of that dotted line is a population estimate that's coming from past Census Bureau estimates, right? Past decennial censuses. Everything to the right of the line in green is a new forecast that we're making this time. And in black is a forecast that was made 4 years ago in 2021, what we had published then. So you'll see that it's lower than the last time we made this forecast. We made the last forecast in 2021. During that time, we didn't have access to the 2020 census, and we didn't understand the impact of COVID at that time. It had already started, but we didn't know the degree to which we were still in this philosophy that everything was going to bounce back. We know that's not the case, and so what we're showing is a slower population growth over time than last time is the big thing. There are differences across, not every city is lower than last time. Some are higher than last time, some are lower, but on average across the county, we're lower than last time. And so I think that's an important thing to take into account. But this is unsatisfying on its own. Like, we want to know why, what's driving this? Why are we seeing a lower population forecast than last time? Why are we seeing slower growth? The biggest thing is that the nature of growth within Lane is changing over time. So this is a components of change graph. Here we decompose change into two factors. Natural change. Natural change is the difference between births and deaths. When there are more births than there are deaths, it's positive natural change. It's contributing to growth within a particular location. When there's more deaths than births, we have negative natural change. It's contributing to decline of a population, right? And then the other factor is net migrants. More people coming in than leaving, positive growth. More people leaving than coming in, negative growth. Lane County has historically, and we expect to continue moving forward, a strong impact of positive net migration. The economy is strong here. There are opportunities here. There are a lot of reasons for people to migrate in. We think that there is going to be a strong impact of that moving forward in terms of net migration, and moving upwards slightly over time as well. We think that this is likely the pattern that is going to happen. For natural change, in 2015, the year period between 2015 and 2019, aging within the county hit such that, and fertility rates declined such that you had more deaths than births in the county. This is pre-COVID. We already had more deaths than births within the county, right? And then 2020 comes and this gets exacerbated. People are having way less children than they were having before. Mortality rates skyrocket during that time with COVID and everything. So you see a huge impact of negative net natural change. And again, our philosophy initially, or the best assumptions initially were that, like, we're going to have a bounce back. Now the philosophy is this accelerated a process that was already happening, especially in terms of birth rates. Some counties, you look at this graph and you'll see that natural change has been negative this whole time and is continuing to increase. Some counties have not got negative net natural change even with COVID yet. But they're all moving in this trajectory of negative net natural change over the time. And again, factor of aging in the population, it's a factor of lower fertility rates over time. And I'll show specifically how those two things impact here. But know that this isn't an assumption about less people moving to the county at all in terms of the slowing population decline. It's really this interaction between fertility and mortality that's driving the slower growth than previously in an aging population. So looking at the birth projections, again, left-hand side estimates, right-hand side forecasts coming in, we saw a big drop off with COVID in terms of the number of births that happened within the county, and we don't think that is going to come back in terms of a strong bounce back. We don't think it's going to continue falling. We think that declining fertility rates and increasing population will stabilize over time so that you have a stable level of birth rates, but we don't think we're going to get the high numbers that we saw. I say high numbers, they were high fertility rates were even higher pre-1990s and things like that, but the high number of absolute births in the county that we were seeing in previous years. And when you compare that to deaths, you see a continued increase over time. And again, this isn't from people living unhealthier or shorter lives than before. This has to do with an aging population. So you see death rates well before COVID had been increasing annually every year, right? And when COVID happened, this got exacerbated. It jumped up really quickly. We think it's going to come down somewhat, as life expectancy improves, but as the population ages over time, that's why we see this increasing number of deaths over time as well. So these are the contributing factors in terms of natural change that are impacting population growth within the county. So looking at life expectancy and fertility rate, life expectancy, we continue to slowly increase over time. Yeah, what is happening?
Oh, there's a drummer out.
Oh, okay, nice. I wasn't sure if it was a parade.
Like 3 feet every day.
Yeah, it's a nice one to be outside during. Life expectancy increasing, albeit slowly. This is what we're anticipating, like moving forward. So Lane County has one of the lower fertility rates, even amongst Oregon. Oregon as a county has a pretty low fertility, or Oregon as a state has a pretty low fertility rate. I think the last one was 1.35, 1.37, somewhere around there. And Lane County is closer to 1.2 something, so even below that. Data here is only reflected up to 2023, but in 2024, we saw a little bit more births than the previous year, like I had mentioned, across like the state of Oregon. So before we had a bounce back, now we're just saying probably leveling off somewhere around this period. I will say I think this is a pretty optimistic birth rate that we're forecasting here, even though it's not coming back up, but the stabilization at this level is optimistic given the decline in the trend that we've seen before. Our understanding of fertility rates, just in theory, have just changed over time. In the 90s, the assumption was it wouldn't fall below 2, because if it fell below 2, then you couldn't replace the population globally, right? Every woman needs to have 2 kids in order to have as many people in the next year as you had in the previous year. Then we saw everyone's fertility rate fall below 2, and then it was 1.5, and now everyone's fertility rate is falling below 1.5, and South Korea is at 0.85 right now as a country, and there are definitely states, locations. I think Portland's you mentioned is at like 0.9 or something as a city. So
Per woman, bearing age.
per woman over the course of a life, yeah, how many kids they're having is the number here.
But
Yeah,
I think that it's also consistent with our idea that like the GQs aren't expanding, because the big reason why lanes is lower is that there's a lot of people who are in that risk pool or college age
Right.
women where, but there's not a lot of births happening in that group. So that's consistent with the idea that we're not having the GQs continue to expand. that
Exactly.
The share of people who are in Lane County in that age group who are students is also declining, which is why the fertility would,
Yeah.
it's why it's lower than the state and why
Oh.
we don't have it.
I should say, yeah, I did mention this during Benton, yeah, that the student age population tends to like have a much lower fertility rate. And it's just because most of them have kids later, at some point, or have fewer kids, but that's kind of artificially lowering and why you see it. I will say, I can't remember I know that for Benton, it's a much larger percentage of the total county, whereas for here, it's a smaller number, but it is something that we take into account. But part of the reason probably why you see this lower fertility rate as well. But I think the older age population is also impacting, oh no, that wouldn't impact that. No, it must be the student population also doing that as
Geeking out
well.
a little bit on this because I think it'd be fascinating to talk to like Hope International or some adoption agency to figure out what their trends are, because families with 2 men can have
Yeah.
children, and I just don't know what those trend lines.
Yeah.
look like.
Yeah, my partner works in child welfare services, specifically in adoption research. So I do know a little bit about this, is that trends are going down as well in terms of that as well. It's not like there is a pickup in that pattern as well. Especially because the same sort of international adoptions philosophy from other countries are changing, in which they're not allowing it for a lot of countries, right? Locations like South Korea and India, where you've seen like a lot of adoptions historically. Now we're not sending anyone international unless it's under very specific reasons. So yeah, I don't think that's shifting in that trajectory, making up for this kind of change right now as well. Yeah. The other thing I should say impacting this, there was this idea for a while too that everyone was pushing out having kids until later time in life, and we've definitely seen women of age 30 and older having an increase in fertility rate, but it doesn't make up for the decline that we're seeing for women younger than that in their fertility rate. So another factor that we have been seeing, and taking into account, but doesn't change the declining overall fertility rate. So age composition. So we know that population's aging. We know that people are having less kids. What does this mean for the total population over time? So again, lane here is going to have a specific impact in terms of its college age population. For most of these over time, and I should say the top two are coming from estimates from the census, the bottom two are for our forecast. This is referred to as a population pyramid if you've never seen it before, where young ages are on the bottom, old ages on their top. When these were conceived, most populations had a very low, strong, like high number of young age, low number of old age, so it looked like a pyramid. It is not the case anymore, but we still call them population pyramids. But here you see the impact of the persisting student age population. We know that the services provided by the university are always going to bring in a certain age of individuals. We maintain that age structure in the group quarters that we're holding and adjust for it. So even as the overall population ages, people age in place within the county, we still maintain that structure of the student age population in there as well. So in this 1990, you can see most of the population is made up by young individuals, and older individuals is much smaller. If we remove the student age population to some degree, it's almost a flat line here over time. It's really like narrowed out, less of a pyramid than what we were seeing before. And we expect that the hump to move forward as well and continue to age over time in the forecast period through 2030 and 2050. Although it's still being impacted again by the student age population. For a lot of locations, yeah, what we're seeing is a decline in the very young age population, so 0 to 5, like the K through 12 population. So you can see in our forecast period between 2020, there were almost 10,000 individual, the left side is male, so 10,000 male there. Whereas in the forecast, it's closer to 8,000, and this is coming from people having less kids and the total population declining over time, slowing of births within the area. Race ethnicity. So starting 2 years ago, we also did forecast by race ethnicity as well. The general trend across Oregon as well is that the non-white population tends to be growing faster than the white population. I should say the groups that we use here are mutually exclusive and include white, Hispanic, Black, Asian Pacific Islander, Alaska, American Indian, Alaskan Native. And when we get data that has multi-race groups, and things of that nature, we probabilistically crosswalk them over to a race that surveys have shown I most identify as this percent of the time, given that so if you're identify as white and Black, we know that a certain percentage would consider their primary race white, certain percentage consider their primary race Black, and we crosswalk them over probabilistically over to there. This isn't a perfect process by any means, and I wouldn't take any of these numbers. Specifically, especially given that we know of phenomenons of people identifying differently, even within their own lifetime period, that race as a construct changes over time as well. This is with our current definitions and our current responses to information within birth and death records, as well as census responses. This is more just to give an idea of the increasing diversity within locations. It also, I think, is an important note to understand the difference in demographics between how people currently identify. While you're seeing a decline in the white population, that isn't the only within Lane, we're seeing this in other locations as well, is the white population tends to be older than other populations within the county as well, and tends to have a lower fertility rate. So I haven't seen this previously, but we're expecting a stabilization and drop in the total white population. This could obviously change, especially given the fact that the Hispanic population, in terms of migration history to Oregon, tends to be pretty new, and we know that multi-generationally, Hispanics tend to identify more often as white when it's third, fourth generation as well. So you might see a shift, and actually the people who marked Hispanic here might end up being white. There is that dynamic. But this is all to say diversifying with the current structure. We have an older age white population, lower fertility population here as well. This is too difficult to make anything out of. There's too many places here, but this will be online. And this is just to allow you to get a comparative sense of all of the locations that you can compare against one another. Most of the plots online are also interactive, so that you can zoom into any particular period, isolate any one location that you want to compare against. You can do that, make comparisons and things like that. So that'll all be up online on Monday. This is just an ad for that, but we have graphs of all of the individual UGBs and everything that we can go through. And I have to pull up my notes on this point because I don't have every city memorized.
You do constantly hear those questions. How do you compare to other cities?
Yes, all of the time. And we're happy to provide specific comparisons and graphs or anything like that. If you want a visualization or if you don't know what you want to see.
That was a good one. I like that.
If you,
Yeah. that-
yeah, nice, we could send that too, but if there's, you don't know what you wanna see, but you have a concern, just like this is what people have been talking about, our job is also to provide you with data and ways of processing data that is intuitive, so I'm happy to make extra graphs, extra maps, anything like that. I mean, I know most, like, all of you are in city planning, so you're very capable of doing that things as well, but like, I'm also happy to help if that's, you know, if that's not your forte or anything. Okay. Okay, up to Cottage Grove. So relative to the rest of the county, if I'm remembering the county numbers correctly, I think the population 65 and older is 20 in the county, and it's a little bit lower here, closer to the state average. And what we're gonna be showing is about 5 slides for each city. In the first slide is just general demographics from census estimates. And these include age 65 plus, which we don't include in our housing unit model explicitly, as well as household income and employment rates. So these are just to give us an idea, again, context for us, like what's happening within the city. Does this match with population growth patterns? Younger populations tend to be growing more quickly than older populations. So if we see a county growing, we want to see, well, what's the age population? 65, that's not always true. But it is tends to be true. Yeah.
Say employment rate, is that the labor force participation rate?
It is of the population who is currently seeking employment, who is employed, which sometimes the labor force participation can be operationalized differently at certain age groups or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't include like that discouraged workers category
Yeah.
for the alternative measures, yeah.
Yeah, it would explicitly exclude the student age population.
So basically, like for Cottage Grove, 7% of the population is unemployed.
Mhm.
Or in this case, just 6, yeah.
4.
6.
Or on this graph, it's, or for 2020, sorry,
Yeah, for 2020.
it's about, am I looking at, oh, I'm looking at housing occupancy, yes, 6%, sorry, yeah.
6% of people who are looking for work don't have a job.
Yeah.
Who want to work don't have a job.
Yeah. And I will say, this is, the employment rate is actually the one that doesn't come from the census. It comes from the American Community Survey, which is a survey. You're gonna have, so it could be a little under, it could be a little over as
So
well.
it's not necessarily tied to the federal unemployment.
No.
The federal unemployment rate, it comes from a different census survey, the
Yeah.
current population survey, but that doesn't have small area
No.
statistics, just higher level like national, state.
Yeah.
Selected metros.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they ask a broad, a more specific questions and they can answer in more detail, but they don't get the small cities. Whereas the ACS gives you less broad questions, but we can get into the small cities, so it's not a perfect indicator, but we can get better signal for certain locations, yeah, yep. And yeah, what we're looking for here isn't any specific level for any one location, it's kind of trend. So again, I would take that 7% with a grain of salt there. If you had to pick a number, this is going to be the best number that you could get. But I would also want to, if you wanted to use this number, I would love to provide you with the uncertainty and just like, here's the high and here's the low. And for our purposes, what we look for is the employment rate declining over time, which we're not seeing here? And then that gives us pause and be like, okay, like what's going on over here? If it's increasing over time, if it's stable over time, we're like, okay, this tends to be like what we should get at rather than any one particular level. And same thing with housing occupancy. We're not looking at any specific level. This isn't true, I think, necessarily for Lane County, but for like Lincoln County, if you're part of those meetings later today, you're going to see housing occupancy rates that are in the 40s and 50s. That's because a lot of them are being, the housing stock there is being used as secondary homes, vacation homes, rental homes, and things like that. And so we're not looking at the low level and knocking them for that. We just want to look for changes in that
That's
as well.
wild.
Yeah, it
Make
is.
estimates for how much vacation homes there is in a city?
We don't have a good data source on that is like national that we can use. We'll try and work with cities and the vacation rental, and maybe Huda can talk.
No, there is, that the ACS does contain that table for seasonally vacant So it's not like it's part, there's a component, a breakdown of the vacancy rate.
But
type
even then,
resource.
that doesn't include like use of like part-time rental and things like that.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know if that's a
Not like,
strong
that's true, not
indicator,
like,
yeah.
If someone is keeping it themselves, like as a vacation home,
Or
then
an-
yes, but if they're letting it out.
Like an Airbnb or something, we wouldn't capture that, which is yeah.
But it would be counted vacant, in
Yeah.
these data, which is a difference when sometimes cities want to compare their own vacancy data, so there's only
Yeah.
3 vacant houses for sale. Census includes a lot broader definition of vacancy, if someone's living there less than the majority of the year, it's vacant.
Um. Where was that? Oh, yes, so what we saw between the 2010 and 2020 census is even though population growth remained relatively stable, 12, 13, 9%, housing increase. Housing didn't increase at the same level. We were seeing 15 and 20% housing increase between the across the 1990 to 2010 census, and then just a 2.7% increase, only 100 new units that occurred afterwards. So we had slower housing growth in the last time that we made these forecasts. So then the post-census estimates that come from Huda are going to be a bigger indicator of like what's going on. It's just like, okay, sometimes the 10-year period can be slow, but like what's happening more recently. And now we have 4 years of post-census data to like go into that. So we have seen a bit more stable population growth over time, 1% annually, 1.6% annually, even though you have these 0 and 0.1s, those are stronger indicators of population growth for Cottage Grove. And so what we're seeing is continued growth over time, but a stabilizing and a slower impact. So not the same kind of linear growth that what we were seeing, but a higher forecast in the short term. This is due to the population growth that happened between 2010 and 2020 that wasn't commensurate with the housing growth. We saw a deviation away, even though housing didn't grow as quickly, population growth continued to move forward. This is the kind of location that we're going to want to make an adjustment for if we were missing a subdivision or we knew about housing units that were coming up in the near term. But right now, without that information, we're keeping it close to the same level, hanging around there, and mostly going off of county trends moving forward. I'm happy to have that discussion now, or if you wanna keep going, yeah.
In the interest of time and respect for others, perhaps we can talk because there is
Okay.
development that's going on that didn't get included.
Okay, yeah, I would love to talk about that, and again, we have plenty of time to incorporate that into there, so yeah, definitely. Yeah, actually, I don't know what time it is. Oh yeah, we have 20 minutes. Crestwell. So here, for Crestwell, interesting situation, right? Even though population has been growing very quickly, we do see a somewhat of a housing growth increase here. But Crestwell has a moratorium in terms of the population, in terms of the number of new housing units that are coming in. It also has an indefinite end to that moratorium. I think best estimates that I saw reading up on it last time was 6-7 years. So that's a long impact in terms of the number of new housing units that can't come into within the area. So you have seen some population growth, but even some population decline within here. But what that means for a forecast is it's going to be slow growth moving forward until we can get more information about when that moratorium ends. I think that for now, given that the moratorium is unlikely to end before the next time that we make forecasts, we're going to be very hesitant to make adjustments to Crestwell moving forward. Just because the planning is going to be difficult until we get a better understanding of where that project is moving forward. And I know no one here, I think, represents Crestwell, but I'm just saying this for our records and everything. This is why you see the much slower growth than last time before we had that information incorporated.
So the dotted bars are
The last time,
forecast.
yeah, from 4 years ago. So Crestwell definitely seeing the biggest impact in terms of the decline over time. Dune City is actually probably, it's more coastal, right? So it's like, it's probably looking a little bit more, that's why you see the housing occupancy so low is there. I think that for the coastal cities, you see more of an impact of that in terms of the housing rate. So it's lower, but it's a stable low, which would probably indicate rental, vacation, or some other kind of homes usually. I don't know that for a fact, but just from looking at a lot of cities, that tends to be the case, and an old age population, which looks a lot more like the coastal cities of Lincoln and everything as well. So it has that profile as well. So population increase, slower housing increase. I will say, that for some of these, there is a certain profile of cities that we've seen in terms of population increase, where when you have a low housing occupancy rate and an old age population, we have noticed anecdotally that ownership of those homes could be from individuals who had historically lived in another location and use that as a rental or a part-time, and then are now moving and retiring into those locations. And this wasn't the case for counties in this region, but for last region, we did have a huge population increase, specifically of the retirement age population. And we wanted to make sure that we were working with those cities, one, to capture that, but also to write those into the report as well, to talk about the change in the services needed because the population is changing so dramatically within those areas. So for Dune City, I also wanted to ask too, and I mentioned this last time, if housing production is limited by geography for the coastal locations, this tends to be the issue. With wetlands within the area, I mean, this can also be the issue with farmlands closer to over here. But because of that, what we're estimating here is slower population growth from before, in this area. Slow housing production, in the past few years, location and everything has caused us to attenuate this down just a bit. I will also say with some of the populations that are in the 1,000 and below range, it's very hard to say like what's going on. One subdivision could completely change the structure of one location. So especially in the 10,000 and below, knowing about those subdivisions is going to give us a stronger signal of like what's happening and everything. So Eugene, major one, very strong population growth for a city of this size, 18, 10, and 11% in the total population. High housing occupancy, employment rate hovering around that 93%. And like before, you're going to get some survey air in there. Persons per household doesn't include the group quarters population at all, right? It is excluding them. So you still see a number that's normal. It's a little bit lower given the age of the non-student population that's within Eugene, but that's where that number is coming from. And everything. And so Eugene is going to definitely see that impact between 2020 and 2021 of a city that has a large student age population and seeing movement out of the city within the area. We've just seen this in all the cities, and this isn't again an Oregon thing. This was a national thing that had a lot happen to it. So we're seeing growth again, but we fell about 1.1 percentage points in that first year. And have had growth, but we're just getting back to that number that we were seeing before, right? 1767, 1771, right? So we've essentially again lost 4 years of growth here, and we're not seeing the huge. We were not expecting a rapid acceleration to match up for that growth. So when we show the plot, just take into mind that like that's why we're seeing lower than last time to some degree. And again, if we ever want to dig into these boundaries, if something looks like it might not be right, also they're going to be online as well if you want to dig into them. They're the same ones that we showed in November, except where we made updates for a couple of cities. So change here, this is a little bit higher than we had in November. We have an increase from the first 10-year percent growth, whereas before we went from 4.87 and it headed downwards in the percent increase. We have a slight bounce back at first in the next 10 years and the more recent. That being said, we're still expecting a slower population increase than last time. This is now accounting for the increase in the group quarter population. So we have that included into there and to make sure that we're accounting for it. And it did make a noticeable difference in the total population. So we are adjusting for that. But this isn't any specific assumption related to Eugene on why you see this population decline. This is more of just like taking into account Oregon patterns of fertility and migration overall. This is a slower growth than what we were expecting before. Lawrence. Again, another coastal city here, why you're seeing this lower housing occupancy rate, population of about 11,000, and again, more slowing of growth in the housing as well. This one I do want to call out because I don't think that we had, and correct me if I'm wrong, a response on this one. I didn't see one. And we're having a strong deviation from the last time we did this patterns, and I'm a little bit less certain on this one. We did see much slowing of housing in recent years, and the reason we incorporated that housing growth slow more is because coastal cities have mentioned, other coastal cities have mentioned that they're unable to produce at the same rate that they included in the past. If this is wrong for Florence, I want to make sure that we get that adjusted. But right now, the growth pattern that we have here is definitely different than what we had last time, and I do want to acknowledge that. And that if we're wrong about that, oh, great, we do have Wendy on here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I just can't figure out my video. There we go.
Oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll get with you. We did do, I know at least one of the surveys and, but I'll get with you. We did have 3 of the 4 projects that we projected to happen, did not happen. And so, and then the ones that
Okay.
got approved kind of during that time have either stalled or have lost their approval. And we definitely have stagnated within the city, so.
Okay, maybe I do have that and I just didn't have the, because my fault, usually only make notes when I make changes or something like that, so I might have missed that, but let's follow up as well, Wendy, and yeah, I'll make sure that I have that on there in my understanding, but you have seen housing production slow within the area is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, our annexations are up, but those are just little one-offs. That are.
Right, right.
Yes, but yeah,
Right, I do that, you have that since 2020, you do have multiple annexations, right? And I do, now I'm seeing on my notes that, yeah, development has stalled and everything. Okay, yeah.
but I'll catch up with you.
And I also should have mentioned, this is just a growth comparison, in terms of growth rate for, any individual UGB, the county, the region, that's all 6 counties combined, and then the US, overall, just so you get a comparison of how does growth for your particular location compare. Junction City in both populations and housing has been growing, quite a bit here. And I do know that we have a 2-year moratorium, if I remember that correctly, on housing development. It's correct, yeah. But given that that moratorium isn't a complete moratorium, right? That there's still a 30-40
Yeah.
unit adjustment for that. We don't think that's gonna have a huge impact in slowing of growth within the area. So we haven't really slowed down the growth rate for housing in that area in order to account for it. So, and we have already seen even post 2020 a big increase in the population. So this is one where we have in the next 20-25 years, it's very similar to last time in terms of the forecast. We still see that optimistic growth rate moving forward. It's a little bit slower in terms of the overall trend, but given that it increased so much between 2010 and 2020, it's right around the same level for that 2025 4-year planning horizon that we were seeing before. Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for, I did get your responses and everything, so I appreciate that. Yeah. I'm gonna hurry up through a little of these unless you want me to slow down for any particular occasion. I realize now we only have 10 minutes. Lowell, older age population that is here and slowing of the housing production within the area, although we have seen some population increases since 2024. No difference between the city and UGB boundaries. We have seen a big jump since 2020 and 2024, but because of the older age population and the slowing in the housing production, we think that's going to cool off considerably in the coming years. If there is a project that we were missing to begin with, I definitely want to hear about it, but otherwise our assumption is a slowing of growth in this location. Oak Ridge, population of 3,000, more stable in that 5 to 6% housing growth, although the population growth hasn't seen a commensurate increase. Part of this might be a difference in the persons per household and the aging of populations I'd mentioned, and you can see this here. Aging populations tend to have a lower persons per household per unit. It's just tends to be an individual or couples in a household rather than like a family. So you see this decline of 2.62 down to 2.18. So even though you have a higher production of housing, it just could be that the structure and the way that people are using housing is different over time on why you're not seeing the population increase over time. And so that's why we've toned down that relationship between housing growth and population growth. You can see that we had a big jump in population last time that we thought was because more housing units were coming into the area, we thought more people were coming into the area. And then when the 2020 census happened, we realized, oh, that relationship is actually being skewed by this aging population. So we have made those adjustments downward since the last time we've made that estimates. And that's why you see a big difference here between those two. Springfield, okay, yes. Sorry, slower housing growth in the coming years, but we also are between 2010 and 2020. Again, this is kind of a pattern that we saw in Lane County overall. So again, more recent years, post 2020 is going to give us a stronger indicator of what we want to look at for housing production within the area. But the other hallmarks of a growing city are within here. Lower than state average POP 65 plus, household income that's growing, housing occupancy that's relatively high, increases, albeit slower than what we had seen before in the population. And I don't know why I don't have a housing graph here. There should be a housing graph there. Anyway, population growth is very similar to what we were expecting before. I have my notes that housing production had increased post census. I might have just missed a slide there in putting that in there, but this is why we have a very similar trajectory and even a bit more growth in the long term than what we were projecting last time. Vanita, I know that we have made adjustments as well in the housing production. And again, I don't know why that housing unit one is in there. That being said, even though we have those increase, like before, last time we made this plot in 2020, it was pretty much a flat line. Now we have increases, but it is a slower increase than what we had from 4 years ago. So up from November, still down from 2021 when we made this graph. And Westford, very difficult to say with a small population like this. And I did not get a survey from this group, but pretty much stable over time. I think that is probably now the best running assumption for small locations moving forward. Yeah, and I just will say, if there is anything, happy to talk about it here, but if you think of something or want to make sure that I get access to data, I definitely want to make sure that we have that on our end, like I had mentioned before, over up until March 15th, in the next couple of weeks, we have some wiggle room to incorporate that new information relatively quickly with less headache. After March 15th, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. And if you want to get something on the calendar right now, we can definitely do that as well to make sure we have 15-20 minutes to talk next week to make sure that we get information. That's something we did at the last meeting. I'm happy to do right now, so we can just knock this out and make sure that we get the information that we do need. If there isn't any more immediate questions or group questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But even after, happy to keep the conversation going. Thank you.